It's great to be here, and thanks for all coming to this series of talks. Hope you find it interesting. I thought for my talk I'd perhaps talk about something a bit different from what I usually do, although I'm very interested in this. Public health is often a discipline which focuses on negative outcomes of behaviours, and understandably so. There's many population level effects, important effects of alcohol use, smoking and drug use, for example, and that's what most of my work looks at. But I think, as I'll argue in this presentation and hopefully make the case, that I don't think that's enough for developing evidence-based policy which is appropriate to our behaviours in our modern society and also has a high level of acceptability with the general public. Public health and public health policy shouldn't, well, certainly not in all cases, be something which is implemented onto populations without their participation and assent. So hopefully some of the things that I'll talk about today in this brief section can give you an idea about what I mean by that. This morning I was reading Euripides, as you do every morning, the Bacchae. I was actually reading it for another reason. It was really interesting that even back in ancient Greece people were talking about the really fine dividing line with regards to intoxication, with regards to, as Euripides described, the madness of the young female population of Thebes, and also perhaps reflecting upon some of the spiritual and some of the celebratory aspects of extreme intoxication with alcohol in this case. So it's been a dialogue, it's been a tension throughout history, and I think we could have a really interesting seminar series actually examining the social and cultural history of drug use and intoxication. But that's not what I'm going to talk about today. It's Christmas, of course, so some nice Christmas related facts, and thanks to my colleague Amanda Atkinson for helping me out with these. The real symbol of Christmas, at least the symbol of Christmas that we're promoting to children and young people, Santa Claus, who gives out presents. But we also leave a present for Santa as well. And we've calculated that there's approximately 6.5 million households with at least one dependent child. Now, here's crossing our fingers that they've not all been naughty and not getting lumps of coal for Christmas. But if they've been good and are accepted, hoping Santa's going to come down the chimney, leave out a glass of sherry and a mince pie, that adds up, you know. Hopefully Santa's got a good constitution and he's booked him for a liver transplant. We've estimated that over the course of one night in the UK alone, it's going to have around about 300,000 times the weekly alcohol guidelines for men, and importantly 1.2 million times the recommended daily calorie intake through his mince pies and sherry. So there's a bit of fun, but to put it in context, that one of our biggest and most looked forward to holidays of the year is around celebration, it's around intoxication, and it's about having that moment and permission of excess, even if it's just once a year. And I think that's really important. And for many people, that permission for excess and participation perhaps extends throughout the world, throughout the year as well. Just as a side note, reflecting that, of course, Christmas, we're all buying gifts at the moment. All the headlines in the news are about how much we're going to spend, pictures of people having fights over flat screen TVs in Tesco's, etc. But drugs are big business as well, illegal drugs. Some really interesting global estimates about the size of the drugs market. This is what consumers actually spend on drugs every year. So, for example, worldwide in relation to cannabis, estimated between 40 and 120 billion. It's a massive range because there's loads of uncertainties there, of course. In the UK, the Office of National Statistics is now considering including some of these so-called illicit industries as part of its national expenditure estimates, including sex work, etc. But with regards to drugs, estimated sales of heroin, amphetamines, cocaine and ecstasy, around about 6 billion. Estimated sales of cannabis, 1.2 billion. Probably a large proportion of that is based here in Merseyside. But even things like growing equipment, £154 million. But this is, a serious point. This is big business. This is a lot of money which has been estimated, which is going into the economy one way or another. And some people have actually argued that if we were able to tax these sorts of behaviours under a different regulatory scheme, then perhaps we wouldn't be having lots of the discussions and arguments that we're having around the closures of libraries, etc. But I think it's also important to bear in mind that something interesting is happening with regards to drug use. drug use, alcohol use and tobacco use over the last 10 or 15 years. Despite ever high numbers of media interest, lurid headlines, etc., all forms of drug use are actually falling. But the key thing is that with respect to illegal drugs, we don't really know why. People have talked about the changes in leisure behaviours, movement of leisure behaviours online into social media, things like that. Other people have spoken about the links between reduction in tobacco prevalence and its close association with cannabis, for example. But the truth is, we don't know why illegal drug use is decreasing. I think we probably have a better idea with tobacco and alcohol. Over the last few years, we've developed some quite coherent and supportive policies around those two behaviours. But importantly, those policies haven't sought to criminalise people involved, so they're much more accessible to the general population. But one thing of interest that I'm particularly interested with colleagues at the Centre for Public Health is the drugs market has developed in new and surprising ways. Everyone's probably heard of so-called legal highs. There was a massive investment by the government in around about 2007, brought together some of its leading thinkers about what would the future of drug use look like. So some of the greatest pharmacologists, chemists and sociologists got together, spent 2 days, and they developed a really big report about the future of drug use. They completely failed to predict the rise of these legal highs. We can't predict what's happening or going to happen. Sticking my neck out here, I think over the next few years we'll have an increasingly more specialised range of substances and drugs, specifically designed for very particular subjective effects. Some kinds of drugs will be specifically targeted towards pleasure, others perhaps towards spiritual practice, as we're seeing, for example, with drugs such as psilocybin and ayahuasca throughout the world. But I think a lot of how our public perception of drug use is formed is often through the popular misconceptions, I think. If you ask a random sample of the general population, in general, what they think about drug use and the images which represent drug use, then these are almost entirely negative images. The image of the dependent user, the image of, I remember going to school, Zammo and Just Say No, and in contrast to that, the values of the drug-free life. And I think to a certain extent that's valid. We're all very aware of some of the problems associated with drug use. So it's important to pay these attention and make sure we have supportive and responsive policies and interventions. But let's reflect really on the realities of drug use. And the majority of the population's experience of drug use is far removed from those sorts of images. If we think, for example, that around about 30% of the general population will have used cannabis in their lifetime, 10% will have used it in the last year, 10% will have used cocaine, 10% will have used ecstasy. So these are not minority behaviours, even though our public perceptions and attitudes of them might be. So I think it's really important, therefore, that our policy, and particularly our drugs policy, begins to reflect some of these realities of drug use. And this is something I saw on the internet the other day, that I think we're far removed from this. But imagine if we spoke about drugs as, in the same sort of language that we talk about other everyday drugs, such as caffeine or nicotine. We should totally catch up this week over a line of cocaine. Does Tuesday morning work for you? Or if I take acid after 5 p.m, substitute for coffee, I have so much trouble falling asleep later that night. Change the name of the drug in these sentences to nicotine or caffeine. Produces a much more socially acceptable response. And I think that's really interesting, that the language we use around drugs and what we associate, what activities we associate drugs with, has been extremely important in how drugs and health policy has developed. Because if you ask people why they use drugs, it's really interesting. A lot of the reasons that people give are quite mundane and obvious, to get high, very non-specific. But if you begin to drill down, and this is something that we've done in our research to try and understand why people are using drugs, they give very, very sophisticated reasons and complex reasons. Some of those are illustrated here. Often it's based on curiosity linked to experimental drug use. I think that's quite clear and obvious. But perhaps there are more sophisticated reasons for drug use, issues around self-medication, and not just for perhaps for physical disorders such as ME or multiple sclerosis, as we often think about with regards to medicinal cannabis. Most people, quite a few people report self-medication with respect to poor well-being or poor mood. How do we actually address that in our drugs policy? And does that say something about how general health policy is developing? All other aspects of life, both functional and instrumental reasons, really important. For example, people desire altered states of consciousness, spirituality, seeking out meaning in life through particular drugs, but also as well identity. Some of the research that we're doing at the moment is seeking to understand how drugs fit into people's identity and whether a narrowing of that identity might actually be one of the reasons why some people develop drug-related problems. And I think actually in our discussion there needs to be space for alternatives to so-called deficit models of drug use. And I've already very briefly alluded to some of those public perceptions, but quite often in academic research and policy making, those negative perceptions are quite predominant as well. And many academics think that drug use, and this might be surprising, actually has evolutionary benefits for drug users, using the term evolutionary in its widest possible concept. And they argue that with regards to evolutionary processes, drug use enabled the pursuit and experience of pleasure or facilitation of social behaviours where naturally it was dangerous to do that, almost like a quick fix. Drugs provided a reliable and consistent way of achieving those particular desired behaviours. Other people have argued as well that one of the most important gaps in much of our discussion around drugs is the whole notion around pleasure and what pleasure actually means, and whether as a society we value pleasure, and whether as part of our policy, no matter what substance we're addressing, we should also be factoring in pleasure and how you actually quantify that. It's controversial, I think. I think you need to weigh up the pros and cons of pleasure versus potential harmful effects of drugs. But I think with regards to thinking about acceptability of interventions and policies, it needs to be considered. Other people have actually argued that drugs could even be considered as instruments to achieve particular behavioural and psychological states, which also confer benefits on the individual. So, for example, if we think about social interaction, if we think about Christmas and Christmas parties ahead, we all enjoy and look forward to our Christmas parties. And we also enjoy having a few drinks as well, because it enables us to make the move from a highly pressurised social and work environment into something which is orientated towards pleasure and, in evolutionary words, reproduction. I think it's an interesting concept, and it's not just limited to alcohol use. This is why many people report use of other drugs as well. In our highly pressured world, drugs provide an easily accessible way of moving from professional identities to leisure identities. And I think this underpins a lot of motivation for drug use. Okay, sorry, a bit small writing here. But what does this mean for drugs and health policy? And this is something I'm particularly interested in. And it's interesting to compare alcohol and drugs policy. One's obviously a legal behaviour, although there's increasingly more restrictions around alcohol use, and drug use is an entirely illegal behaviour in most parts of the world. It's interested in alcohol policy. In national policy documents, pleasure is allowed, pleasure is facilitated, and there's a distinction between so-called responsible drinking and irresponsible drinking, that certain patterns of drug use are acceptable. And it's actually argued that those patterns of drug use are beneficial for society and the economy and the individual. Many people in public health want to challenge those assumptions, but it's certainly what's evident in policy. Contrast that to drugs control and drugs policy, where discussions of pleasure are almost entirely missing. If you look at some of the international conventions, it talks about how non-medical drug use has no benefits whatsoever. However, if you talk to the people that I talk to and my research team talk to who take drugs, they can quite clearly outline the pleasures that they experience, or at least they perceive. So I would like to argue that we need to have a more sophisticated view when we're thinking and talking about drugs and developing policy. And I think we need to reflect the experiences of users a bit more, actually. Taking some lessons from alcohol policy, can policy actually be effective or accepted by the general population if we deny the experiences of those who participate in that behaviour? At the moment, we are denying those experiences, and I would actually argue that this is why a lot of drugs policy is failing. Okay, thanks very much. Just out of interest, that's Brian Barrett, who was a writer, a raconteur and traveller in the 1960s. He hung out with Timothy Leary, and his autobiography was called The Road of Excess. And that's he wrote and dedicated his life to pleasure, although he's not a role model. Okay, thanks very much. Okay, thanks. I think we have time for questions now, is that right?
That's right, thank you.
Any questions or comments from the floor?
How do you see, there's a bit of a big question actually, but how do you see sort of current UK drug policy, government policy going? Do you see it becoming more reactionary, less reactionary?
Ooh, that's a big question. Yeah. I think UK drugs policy is probably running in opposition to much of the thinking throughout the world, particularly in some of the policy developments in other parts of Europe and some states of the United States and places like Uruguay as well. And I just want to cite the example of New Zealand and how they've responded to the rise of legal highs. So in New Zealand, what they've actually do is they've allowed licensing of particular drug products. And they've said that under these licenses, that it will be legal, within restrictions of course, to sell products which have been proven to be of lower risk. That to me seems a sensible way because it fulfills people's desire to take drugs and to become intoxicated, but also bears in mind the responsibility of the state with regards to safety and post-market monitoring. So I think we have a lot to learn from other parts of the world. And it was interesting that the Home Office did commission an international review of drugs policy, which many of you might have seen a couple of weeks ago. So various members of the government and civil servants jetted off around the world to review drugs policies, but unfortunately the Home Secretary rejected that out of hand.
It may be a bit early yet, but are there any interesting effects on social perception or government policy locally within states in the US that have legalised cannabis, like Colorado?
I think that's a really interesting question. I think that the interesting situation in the US is that it doesn't have federal government support, those policies do, but at the state level it has great support. But another interesting thing with the American experience is that those changes in law, and it's only a few states we have to bear in mind, have been driven by the general population. They've not been driven by academics or policymakers. It's been the general public who've asked for those votes to be put on the ballot, really. So that's quite interesting that it's almost the general population, a grassroots campaign, to excuse the pun, to legalise cannabis in those states.
Because they're seeing tax revenues now, which some of the local politicians have been crowing about. They've been saying we can now do good things with this money. So there is a payback in real terms.
That certainly is. I do worry about, not that my opinion counts for anything, I do worry about what's happening in the United States though, with the rise of big business and big cannabis business. Many of you might have read in the papers about how Bob Marley's family was beginning to work with some venture capitalists in New York to start to advertise and market Bob Marley brand cannabis. You can say that's fair enough, they've been exploited for many years, but I do worry about the role of big business, particularly considering the history of tobacco and alcohol, which has been almost entirely driven by big business and industry for many years and has led to many of the problems that we do experience today. Any further questions? Yes, please.
The social acceptability towards substance consumption rather than abuse, does that inform the definition of it from country to country?
Simply no. It's drugs. All countries around the world, they have to sign up to the United Nations conventions, which doesn't take into mind, or it doesn't incorporate any social perceptions really. However, how member states around the world actually interpret those laws, as we've seen in different countries, does reflect. So there's definitely a contrast between international activity and member state activity. So a country such as Czech Republic or Portugal, for example, couldn't have introduced their radical new drug laws or ways in responding to drugs if it didn't have that public support. One of the most interesting things that I've read recently, and I know this is probably controversial on Mers's side, is for the first time ever that I've remembered that the Sun's readers are now a majority of those are in favour of changes to drug laws to think about how to respond to drugs differently. And if you take the view, although it's a rather simplistic view, that the Sun is the voice of the people, is a simplistic view, then I think there is something which suggests that in the UK that there might be a disconnect between what the politicians are saying and thinking and perhaps what the general public are now thinking. And I think a lot of that's got to do with how drugs is now become a high-profile issue. And in many respects, it is moving away from more of the sensationalist aspect. Tonight on BBC Three, I think it is, we have Russell Brand, good old Russell Brand, talking about and examining drug laws. We have Professor David Nutt and colleagues, for example, who've been very eloquently talking about the challenges and realities of drugs policy. I think that's been really important in challenging public perceptions. So I think maybe these things might work together to change perceptions in the UK, but at the moment it's not a vote winner. Okay, is that fine? Thanks.
That's lovely. Thank you very much, Harry.